Okay, I'm sure everybody listening to this has heard the phrase on the screen here at some point in their lives that goes something along the lines of, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And I want to talk a little bit about that phrase and some of the deeper meanings embedded within it. But first, this is from a website, gotquestions.org, which I had never heard of until I did a little searching on this phrase. So I have no idea if this is a legitimate interpretation, but I'm going to assume that it's at least pretty close in terms of the context that surrounds this phrase attributed to Jesus as recounted in the Bible. Specifically, the question here is, what did Jesus mean when he said, "He who is without sin can cast the first stone" in John 8:7? And they give a little explanation down here that I'm going to read. Jesus' statement, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her," is found in John 8:7. Jesus was teaching in the temple when the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and they asked him if she should be stoned as required by the law of Moses. Obviously, we're in a much different time period here where someone was stoned to death for adultery. Think about the world as we know it right now and the divorce rates among married couples and just the state of relationships in general, and how much cheating or adultery goes on in these relationships. I mean, it's very prevalent. This is an act that has become so normalized that people don't even think twice about it, either doing it or hearing about someone else doing it. It's not even a big deal anymore to hear about this. Whereas 2,000 years ago, this is something that you were murdered for. Stoned to death. Now, of course, in terms of the quote-unquote law that existed at the time, they wouldn't call that murder. They would call that eye for an eye, just punishment, right? It wouldn't be considered a murder if they stoned this woman to death for adultery. That's a product of the larger sickness that's going on here, but still, we're talking about a much different time. But right away, we can get an idea of just how further fallen we are from these times as it relates to how we interact with other people and what is considered normal. However, they cared nothing about this woman. They were using her to trap Jesus. In their minds, if he told them to set the woman free, they could claim he did not hold to the law of Moses. If he told them to stone her, they could claim he was not the Savior. And if he said nothing, they could claim he lacked wisdom. Jesus did not answer immediately, but stopped and wrote something on the ground, and they kept pressing him. Finally, the Lord said, in essence, "Go ahead and stone her, because that is what the law requires. But the law also requires that the first stone be thrown by a person who is sinless in connection with this charge." So what he's saying here is that, hey, go ahead and stone this woman to death for committing adultery, assuming that none of you have ever been adulterers and engaged in the crime that she is accused of here, because that's what your law also says. So if we take this story at face value, we're talking about that which created us incarnated onto earth in a human body, in this moment knowing that all of these people are not innocent of what they are accusing this woman of. And therefore, it knows that it has caught them in an impossible situation, even though they were trying to entrap him by presenting this situation. There is no doubt that this woman was guilty of a capital offense and that the law required that she be stoned. But the law also required that the guilty man be stoned as well, meaning whoever she was in the adulterous relationship with, that man had to be put to death at the same time. Witnesses must be produced, and that witness must begin the execution. So there's a lot more to the story here, right? If someone is caught committing the act of adultery, the woman or the man, but we can assume it would be the woman in these times, is put to death by stoning, and the man that she was in that adulterous situation with, and the person who witnessed it would be the one that had to cast the first stone. Because the witness is saying something very serious, right? This is a serious allegation that can result in 2 people's deaths. So they're taking into account the fact that that person's conscience must be clear enough to actually throw a stone at these people. Now, given the state of planet Earth and the influence on our minds from that which is in control here and was in control back then as well, yes, there would be times where this process would be taken advantage of, just as it is now, where people are set up for crimes that they didn't commit. But we're talking about a time before technology where a witness would be all you could rely on. It would be their word against yours. So at the very least, they're saying here, hey, you have to be the one that throws this stone and begins the execution if you're going to accuse these people of adultery. Obviously, I'm not defending the law of Moses that existed at the time or trying to make it seem reasonable in any way. I'm just explaining it as it existed. Hopefully that is clear here. But the Jewish leaders came with venom against Jesus and were thwarted by their own single-minded hate. They did not produce the guilty man, and they were unwilling or unable to produce the required witnesses. We do not know what Jesus wrote, but after he wrote a second time, the Jews left one by one, from the oldest to the youngest, without saying another word. Jesus then set the woman free with a warning to her to sin no more. This reminds me of The Matrix for some reason, where Morpheus and Neo are having a conversation, and Neo says something along the lines of, "What, so you're saying I can dodge bullets?" And Morpheus goes, "No, I'm telling you that when you're ready, you won't have to." And in the context of the plot, it's like, hey, when you figure out what you're actually in, you won't even need to dodge the bullets, because as they show you later, you'll be able to just stop them because you know it's an illusion and you can literally pick them out of the air. And it's just evoking that scene in my mind here because this is kind of the level that this being would be operating on when it was on Earth. And it would perplex, I'm sure, the powers that be in a way that they had never experienced before. Where they have this genius plan to entrap this guy who's saying all these things and ruining their scams that are going on and awakening people to the truth of how far gone they are in terms of their intended design originally. And they set the plan in motion and it is all unraveled almost immediately. And they just slowly, one by one, walk out of the room and don't say anything. It's like, yeah, he didn't even have to dodge the bullets. He just picked them out of the air. So that's the background, biblically speaking, as it relates to the phrase allegedly attributed to Jesus, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." It's a very powerful lesson as it relates to how we've been trained to behave in this world. And I was getting into that a little bit in the last recording titled "I Rest My Case," where I'm talking about how we're trained to build these cases in our minds as we point the finger at everybody but ourselves. And a lot of the time, people are so far gone that they'll point their finger at somebody for something that they do themselves, and they will judge them very harshly, inexplicably in those moments. It's like, hey, you're doing this thing you're accusing the other person of and making them feel shameful about. What's wrong with you? Do you not see the hypocrisy here? I mean, ultimately, it's a lesson in hypocrisy to see that and not engage in it. It would be like an alcoholic pointing their finger at somebody who is drinking alcohol and criticizing them for it. And it's like, dude, you're an alcoholic. You can't criticize someone else's drinking. What's wrong with you? And that's sort of what's being implied here. You're also quick to judge other people for things that you do too. And obviously that's not the design that was built into us from the beginning. We're not designed to interact with each other in that way. Accusing each other in that way is something that was programmed into us because it creates discontent and it fractures relationships and just makes it more difficult for all of us to see each other as we truly are and come at each other with the correct intentions. And I think this is very useful to keep in mind, especially when things like what's going on with Sean Combs right now are in the news. There is a lot of things far worse than adultery going on in the world in terms of sexual abuse. We all know what's going on. It's very dark. And the entities that are engaging in it have a serious problem. But I would be out of my mind if I came on a recording like this and started pointing my finger at them for how evil and bad they are when I myself have my own sexual depravity and dysfunction going on. Now, is it on the level that theirs is? No, of course not. But that's like trying to separate degrees of alcoholism, you know what I mean? On some level, every alcoholic is an alcoholic. You could go into degrees about how much they drink and try to separate them and say one's functional and the other isn't, so the functional one is better than the non-functional one. And you can go through the scales of it like that and try to create artificial distinctions in your mind. But at the end of the day, you're all alcoholics of some shape or form. So for you to point your finger at anybody else drinking would be insane because you're doing the same thing they are. To have some opinion on their drinking as if you're better than them because yours is perceived as somehow less bad in terms of drinking, well, that's just insanity. And that's what this story is about as it's recounted in the Bible. You would bring this woman to me to trap me, accuse her falsely of adultery, when you yourselves, even if I took this as a legit scene in front of me, you yourselves are engaging in adultery. You're engaging in the very thing that you're accusing this woman of, that you would send her to her death for, just to diminish me in some way, because I'm apparently so dangerous to this thing you're addicted to, this whole thing you've created for yourselves. So keeping true to the lesson in this story, if I'm going to discuss the things that are going on in the world, I have to be honest about what's going on with me. I can't be the one that casts the first stone because I'm guilty of it too. I have lustful thoughts about women all of the time. I don't know if that's just a product of being a man in this world in the year 2024, where we are bombarded with sex all day, every day, in every form of media, in any way that you can consume it. Pornography is widely distributed and free to access on the internet, which isn't by accident. They want it to be freely accessible, so you willingly corrupt yourself. And of course, it's like anything else, the form of sex that they are portraying to you through the pornography that they create is extremely depraved. And there's no kind of genuine interaction taking place. It's like, we could make some distinction. If there was gonna be porn, it would be from people who are hopelessly in love with each other and expressing that to themselves. And at least if people were going to watch something along those lines, it would provide them with that example of, hey, this is how you treat a person that you're going to have sex with. Wouldn't that be good, I think? Like, if we're going to do this at all, I mean, ideally, we wouldn't have lust going on in our minds in any way, and we wouldn't be searching out watching it in the first place. But, hey, as kind of a middle step, if we were going to get away from that, at least that should be what we're watching, right? But is that what we're given? No. I use that as an example to show how different that is from what we're shown. And I'm like most people, especially men, alive on planet Earth. I've spent 20 plus years off and on since I had access to the internet looking at pornography, looking at sex taking place on a screen. And it's like any other addiction. I go through phases with it. When I was younger and didn't have a girlfriend, I would be watching it all of the time, thinking this was completely normal. And then, as I became more aware of what was going on, the cycle would change where I would relapse back into it, knowing it's something that I shouldn't be watching, but for whatever reason, like it is with any other addiction, I would create reasons that justified it. Well, I'll just do it for a little bit. I've been so good. I haven't watched it, and I just feel like I really need to do this. Like you tell yourself with any addiction, you know? Yeah, that would be fun. I should do that. And 2 minutes into it, you realize, oh, this was a horrible mistake. And then for whatever reason, you finish. Because that's just how you're programmed to act. And you just, well, I went this far, I guess I should just do it. It's like any other addiction. I've brought up drinking a few times. If you haven't drank in a while and you decide, you know what, I'm going to have a couple beers. And you take 3 sips of the first beer and you have all those feelings flood back into your body that reminds you of why you stopped in the first place. And this only happens after you've quit for a long time, where you realize that. If you're early on in the cycles of trying to quit something, you won't realize that. You'll just relapse right back into how you used to be. But slowly over time, as you get out of the cycle and the relapses become less and less frequent, you really start to notice it when you go back to it, why you stopped in the first place. And ideally, you get to the point where you never go back, and that's just an ongoing process. Especially as it relates to pornography on the internet or just anything like that. For me, I have these folders that are constantly coming into existence and then getting deleted. For a long time, I just had a porn folder on my computer that had all of these videos on it that I deemed somewhat not offensive, and I was able to achieve the goal that those videos serve the purpose of. And I deleted that years and years ago, the original one that I had. And then it's so funny, when I relapse, I'll create a new folder. And there'll be a couple videos in there. And eventually I'll decide, okay, this is ridiculous. I need to stop doing this, and I'll delete that folder. And then a new one comes into existence a year or two later, or whatever it is, right? Depending on what you're going through and what comes up, that folder comes in and out of existence. And I'll be fully honest here, because that's the point of this exercise. I even have old photos from old girlfriends that have not been deleted for whatever reason. Should I delete these? Yes, of course. Have I? No. And they're just in there. And from time to time, I'll convince myself, well, I'll just look at those. They're real people that I was actually with. There's nothing bad about that, right? I won't look at the actual real porn. I'll just look at this. And so I keep that folder for that reason. When I decide, oh, I'm not going to look at pornography anymore, I'll just look at those. So not only do I have all of that going on, where I'm going through these cycles of not looking at any of it, and then I go through the cycle where I am looking at the stuff. And I'll tell you what, over the years, the time between the relapses has increased, which I'm proud of. And what I have learned through that process is that I feel so much more alive and connected to that which created me and just reality in general. I feel so much more in the flow of life and worthy of love when all of that is going on, when I'm not looking at that stuff, than I do when I am looking at it. It's almost like a self-sabotage, where I'll be feeling so good and content with where I'm at that I say to myself, this can't possibly be correct. I'm not worthy of this. I'm going to go watch some porn for a couple weeks and just take myself out of it. This is too intense. I don't deserve any of this. That's it. I'm going back to the porn. And I'm sure that there's a part of that going on with the entities that are addicted to what they're doing, where even if they wanted to stop, and even if they have stopped doing it from time to time, they'll always kind of fall back into it, because what they have done is super evil and depraved. There's no getting around that. That they feel like they're not worthy of anything that any of us would try to describe to them in any way that a sinner can describe God's love to someone else, right? I mean, we can only half-heartedly do it because our hearts are not pure, right? I mean, it's very difficult for us to explain that I mean, all we can do is lead by example and show that we're trying, and then by observing us, they can maybe see, well, I guess there is something to this. If this person, who I have observed do very depraved things, sexually speaking, somehow transcending that in some way, shape, or form, at least temporarily when they're not giving into it. But the most difficult part is the lustful feelings and thoughts when you're interacting with other people that you would otherwise just want to have a normal interaction with. And that's very frustrating for me. I've met some wonderful females, because I'm a male, obviously, I'm coming at it from that perspective. And of course, I'm making the assessment in my mind because it's insane, no matter what we're talking about or how deep it is or how much it relates to anything but sex. I will have the thought stream going through my mind, considering whether or not I would have sex with this person, right? Making those judgments, thinking about it. And if the answer is yes, I would, then I'm imagining it, right? Like, it's insanity. And it's exhausting walking around as a man with that going on in your mind. And the only thing that can pull you out of that is the love of God. It's the only thing that can do it. And I'm hesitant to even use the word God now because famous celebrities use that phrase and say they believe in God. So what does that word even mean? Right? It ties in directly to what I'm going to go into further here about the word and the tone, right? All we can rely on at this point is the tone through which a word is expressed, because the words have no meaning at all. Anybody can say the words. We have to rely on the tone. And that's kind of the other part of let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I went into this in an old recording about the sword and the stone, that story as it relates to King Arthur, how he was the one who was able to pull the sword from the stone. And the Arthurian legend in that context and everything he became was the result of him pulling the word from the tone, in other words. Learning the secret of frequency and how that is able to impact everyone's minds, bodies, hearts, and souls, right? The whole thing. The word, the power of it, and the frequency you embed within it can control a mind. And they have perfected this art through the media. They mind control us with no problem whatsoever through this process. And it's the same thing going on the internet, on social media. It's a bunch of people casting stones for things that they themselves are guilty of, but somehow the detachment of being on the internet has not only allowed people to see this as something acceptable, but they fully embrace the hypocrisy of typing something on social media and judging someone and coming down on them and sending negativity and judgment and shame their way when it's something that they do themselves, right? Whatever it is, that they've completely lost the plot. You see this all the time. I mean, this is the role that celebrities and other famous people play. They absorb energy. And so that's what the humiliation rituals are. That's what all of the stories that they are scripted to perform are. It gives people something to engage in hypocrisy with. They are given the news of whatever these people did, and then they've been trained to type something, to say something about it, to have an opinion on it, to judge it. Meanwhile, it involves in some way, shape, or form something that they too do themselves. So they are casting the first stone, and it's something that they also do, violating elementary principles of how to not be a hypocrite. But that is another way you could view he who is without sin casts the first stone, because stone then can be viewed as tone, and sin can be viewed as sign or a sine wave relating to time. So it's another way of saying, let he who is out of time cast the first stone, which is another way of saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Meaning the only entity that should be judging anyone for these human affairs is that which created us, that which created our ability to speak in the first place. It was the original vibration, the original frequency that was embedded into the fabric of reality itself, which is why we have a resonance electromagnetically speaking, connected into the fabric of the planets, called the Schumann resonance. We are embedded with the ability to resonate with the frequency of the planet as it was designed originally. And if you really look at it, all of the mind control, everything that it does is designed to mess with that frequency and get us acting in a way that is not natural. That's why it's so powerful to go place your feet on the bare soil or the bare ground or whatever surface you're near, because you discharge a lot of that artificial frequency out into the ground and it rebalances you. So not only is this story about Jesus teaching you something about hypocrisy and judging other people without first looking at yourself, it's also a deeper idea about frequency and tone and the word. We as sinners are confined to time because it's an element of this reality. It's an element of existing here. We as human beings are subject to it in a way that which created us is not. It is outside of sin. It's outside of time. And due to the nature of this world currently, we will sin in it, no matter what we do, right? So this is something that you really want to keep in mind as they continue to reveal the truth of what has been going on as it relates to human trafficking and pedophilia and just that whole thing in general, the sexual dysfunction of it. Yes, it is evil. Yes, it should not be going on in any way. But at the same time, if you're not looking at your own sexual depravity and how you are contributing to it in your own way, whether you like it or not, I mean, I'm speaking to the majority here. I know there's probably some people listening to this who are not similarly depraved like I am or like most men are. But if you're honest with yourself, you will see how you are just as detached from creation as they are. It's just you're doing it in a different way. Indeed, you're doing it in a way that they have given you the access to, knowing that you will be weak and give into it. Most of the time, anyway. And that's part of what becoming aware is. It's gaining the strength to say no, gaining the strength to not engage in these things, which will be a very lonely existence, right? Because as you continue to say no, you isolate yourself further and further from the world. And that's a very difficult thing to deal with. As someone who has been doing it for a decade plus now, let me tell you, the isolation is difficult. It wears on you in that way. It's a lonely existence. And you have to be very at peace with that, knowing that your decisions are going to lead you down that path and knowing that there is no other option. Either you give in to what you know is destroying your soul or you adhere to what you know will maintain it. It's very easy to give your soul away. That's why the system is set up as it is. It's a soul collection system. It slowly breaks your will over time and you give yourself to it. And everything in society normalizes it and makes it seem like, oh yeah, that's no big deal. We all do that. And indeed, that's part of why I would imagine they do what they do, because over so many centuries of being the ones who implement the agenda, the bloodlines that are running this whole show just see themselves as an entirely different thing than we are. We don't even cross their mind as something that is the same, which is why we're viewed as cattle, right? That are to be herded here or there, and the flock is to be culled from time to time with no emotion whatsoever. I mean, that's what they do, right? But if they start to take responsibility for what they have done and understand that they can be forgiven for it, not by me, I can't do that, but by that which created us, it can do that for them. And we at the same time, in our own way, are seeking that out. There is a point where we can meet in the middle. However far-fetched or crazy that might seem right now, I really think that is a possibility down the line. If we remember what we were taught by stories like this, by let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And you know, it's interesting. as a part of this, I was thinking about the images of Jesus and how that's such a big problem for everybody. Just the whole story is a big problem for everybody. And I admit I have my own issues with it that I've gone into in prior recordings. But I think people are missing the point entirely. This is like, for the YouTube potential censors, I'm going to say this phrase for educational purposes because it is written on other places of the internet. Okay? I'm not saying this is my phrase. All right? But you can go to 4chan in particular and find people using the phrase Christ cuck. And their whole thing, because it's a honeypot psyop designed to play into the anti-Semitism psyop, right? That whole thing is set up in advance, so you point your finger at the quote-unquote Jews, and then they have the anti-Semitism infrastructure in place to remove any truth that is in there. That's how the whole thing is set up. So anyway, you'll find people on there using that phrase because, according to the story that they have given us, Jesus was quote-unquote Jewish. And there are not many things that I'm sure of in this world, but one of them is that Jesus, that which created us incarnating into a body, was in no way, shape, or form Jewish as we think of it today, okay? That's just ridiculous. It makes no sense, all right? No. That being that incarnated into the body of a human being transcended any kind of truth that related to the actual meat suit itself. And when you think about let he who is without sin cast the first stone in that story, what did it involve? Well, it was surrounding the Pharisees and the scribes, who were quote-unquote Jewish at the time, and they were the ones that were implementing the law. They were a big source of the disorder, the problem that was going on, the disease. And so it was logical, if this transpired as we were told, for that being to incarnate in a human form in that place during that period in time. Because obviously it has a long-term plan for how this will all unfold, and that was the first domino. That place, that time. So yes, the meat suit, genetically speaking, might have certain markers that it would be identified as a certain thing, okay? But it was in no way, shape, or form a Jewish entity. So you're really missing the point of it all if you focus on that detail that they have used to create this whole system of Christianity that isn't what that being was talking about at all. And you use that to discredit it. Like, oh, well, we can't pay attention to that in any way. Oh, in fact, that's designed to mislead us because, look, they're saying that this guy you're following is Jewish. And the people who run the world claim that they are Jewish as well. Again, for the censors, this is what other people are saying. I'm just relaying it. This is not what I think or believe, okay? Surely we can still discuss things that are factually in the world. I don't know. I shouldn't say surely. They are certainly trying to get to the point where we are not allowed to do that anymore. But while I still can in the United States of America, via the First Amendment, I'm going to do this. So anyways, that is entirely missing the point. You are not a Christ cuck if you look at the parables and the words attributed to that being, however much they've distorted it over time through Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and all of the mainstream religions. You're losing the plot if you focus on that little detail to discard all of it. Because, of course, as people much smarter than I have told you in a very logical fashion, they're going to take those teachings and use it for themselves. They're going to create their own copy of it and use it to control you because it's so powerful. Of course they would do that. But along the same lines, you'll see people criticizing the images of Jesus because, as I have on the screen here, there are known images of this person, and that is all by design, don't you see? Of course there would be no images of it because the being that incarnated into that body, that which created us, it designed the whole thing so there would not be an image attached to it because it was for everyone. Do you get that? It was for everybody, no matter what they looked like, no matter where they came from. It was designed so they would create their own image of the being that looked like them. So it's natural. It's not, mind control or some psyop that there are images of Jesus looking like a white, quote unquote, European male, any more than it's a psyop that there are images of Jesus looking Middle Eastern or Chinese or Japanese or Mexican or black, African, however you want to view it. It's designed so every different potential human being on planet Earth would see itself in the being, because that's what it was designed to do, to jumpstart the dead car battery, as it were. Again, as someone much smarter than I described it, right? That being incarnated here to do that, to spark the spirit within you that was dormant because of the mind control here and the just general reality that we all experience. Becoming born again into that which created us. The spirit, however you want to refer to it. The terms, again, are not important. It's the frequency embedded within them. It's the tone. Let he who is without sin cast the first tone. So even me speaking right now and kind of even alluding or pretending like I'm somehow close to that tone? No. No. Maybe a little bit more than your average person because of all the research and thinking I've done all this, but no, I'm not anywhere close to that tone, to the tone that is without sin, right? I'm nowhere near that. So anyways, don't look at it like, oh, those people are so out of their mind. That man 2,000 years ago would have had dark skin and would have looked like this. And he wouldn't look anything like the images they're portraying. They're crazy. And it's some competition for who's the most chosen, right? No, the real picture of Jesus was this, and that means we're the chosen people. No, you're all out of your minds. Everyone is the same in the eyes of God on this level. It came here to provide value to all of you. And so, it would have been set up that no images would ever be recorded of whatever this being looked like. So that, like I said, everyone could see itself in it and imagine the being looking like them, so that it would have the most powerful effect. And people do the same thing with the words in the Bible too. They try to go through it like it's some kind of code describing who the real chosen people are, right? No, we're the group that's chosen. They took that from us. And it's like, no, the whole thing is for everybody. You're all missing the point. And that's the key to the whole thing, understanding the frequency or the tone of that which created us. And when you understand that, you can't be lied to anymore. It's nearly impossible. Now, you can know the truth and choose to ignore it, which is not what I would advise to do. I've done that before, as I described earlier, and you really pay the price for that. I mean, it hits you hard when you know you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. But even in that, it allows you to deviate from time to time and experience that, and it forgives you ultimately. Like, hey, I know you're struggling with this, and I'm not going to hold it against you. And so that is the example that ultimately we must strive for, even when presented with the most heinous evil things, the most horrific murders, rigging a person's pager to explode in their hand one day, and maybe taking out a few innocent people, no big deal. I don't need to describe all of the things that are going on. That's just one of the more recent ones. Yes, we're going to be presented with things that conceivably have no redeemable aspect. There's no way we can look past this. And indeed, we're too fallible to do that. We're going to look at that and say, you guys are out of control and this is unacceptable. And I am angry and furious and there's nothing you can say that will take me away from that. We're going to hang you guys in the streets eventually. You know what I mean? And it's like, well, that's not going to accomplish anything, for a variety of reasons, because you don't think in the long term about what that might do to you. What would it do to you if you actually hung somebody in the street somewhere? How would you deal with that? I mean, soldiers come back from war, from doing similar things with PTSD that cripples them, and a lot of them commit suicide because they can't even deal with that. Now, I'm sure some people listening to this would approach that with a sort of sacrificial angle and say, well, I'm willing to do that for the rest of humanity. I'm willing to take that on to save us all. And it's like, well, you got to understand that you would just be hanging somebody who isn't ultimately responsible for what's going on in the first place. They're just the street muscle that they send out. They're not the Don sitting back wherever they are giving the orders. And you know what the Don does? When you take out one of its street muscle enforcers, it just gets another one, right? I mean, it's not even a big deal to it. So that would just embolden and further all of the killing that's been going on for thousands of years here. Which again is a product of the food chain in general, which is probably a distortion of how we're supposed to be functioning originally, because killing things to survive just makes killing a human being not a big deal. And part of it is the desensitization through the media to people being killed as well. That makes it seem like no big deal, and nobody even bats an eye anymore because we've been shown so much of it on the internet. Or even television through the local news before the internet. If it bleeds, it leads. So I don't need to tell you guys about all of that. You know what's going on as it relates to the system, but I gotta bring examples in every now and then to make the point a little clearer. Oh, speaking of which, there was one image that I wanted to show along these lines, and this is from Twitter, but it's very similar to what you would find on 4chan as I was going into it. And you can see from the avatar here that it's likely inspired by that kind of ideology, where the sentence is, I'm a Christian, but I'm starting to feel ashamed that I worship a Jew. And you can see that angle coming to the surface as they really let this anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish sentiment out into the wild, as it were. I went into this in the Rise of Christian Nationalism recording, where it's very obviously a part of the agenda to let this thing run wild, to let it be allowed on social media, because they're going to use it as a part of their plans to censor free speech down the line. That's why everyone's being allowed to say these things about quote-unquote Jewish people. They planned this probably 1,000 years ago, okay? Like, it's very meticulously planned, and it's happening step by step. You have to take yourself out of whatever is going on currently and see it for what it is in terms of the longer agenda that was planned a long time ago. But I wanted to address this angle in particular because the man they call Jesus, that which created us, coming into this reality, if it happened as they say it did, which I believe happened, I see no reason to doubt it, given what transpired back then and what they have turned it into and how powerful it is and how impactful just invoking the name of Jesus is in people's lives and what it does for them, there has to be something real there. Now, is it exactly as they describe it through their religions? Of course not. But the story, the elemental truth of it is undeniable. And this is a part of getting people to tear themselves away from it. Where they look at what's going on in the world, they have all of this evidence that these people are quote-unquote Jewish, and then they look back at this story of Jesus where it's claimed that he was Jewish in the same way that people are Jewish today. And it's like, no, that's like 1,000 layers of mind control that you have to untangle to get to the truth of what's actually going on. And hopefully I did an okay job of untangling that a little bit so you can see what's going on a little more clearly. At least what I perceive it as. Am I right? Who knows? But that was what I wanted to get into as it related to let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Hopefully that story makes a little bit more sense especially as it relates to being without sin or out of time. And I realize now as I'm saying that I never went into that in particular. This is a sine wave, which is a function of time. It's a periodic measurement of frequency. So hopefully you see how that relates to being without sin and not casting a tone. Because we're talking about a tone and frequency. And indeed, I would assume this is why in Back to the Future, this town is called Hill Valley, where Marty McFly and Doc Brown live. The hill and valley of a sine wave. In the context of a plot that involves time travel and lightning bolts or energy and frequency sending people through different points in time. And I'm not getting into that whole symbolic thing, what they put into all those movies. I already did that. I'm not going to do that in this one. This is all about let he who is without sin cast the first stone, and how I'm just as guilty in some way of all of the things that we would point our fingers at them for. And I have to accept responsibility for that. My lustful thoughts, my pornography addiction, just my addiction to having orgasms in general. That's a difficult subject altogether to deal with, as I've gone into in the past, because the orgasm produces the thing that creates life. So to some extent, we need to be having orgasms to perpetuate the species, unless you want to take the full antinatalist, nihilist route and say, well, we should just eliminate ourselves. But if we assume that we were put on this earth to procreate and multiply to some extent, then the orgasm is necessary. So finding that balance to that being a thing that we do and not allowing it to turn into what it is currently on planet Earth is delicate. And I am just as much afflicted with it as anyone else, and still struggling with it to this day. Though I will say at the end here, as long as we're being honest, I very recently fell back into the pornography addiction. That's what kind of spawned this recording in the first place. And I went on YouPorn, I believe, for the first time in, I don't even know, over half a decade. I mean, a long time. It had been years since I went on one of these websites because I had the folders, and I had an old folder from the last time that I quit watching pornography that was all still there. So I had no reason to go to these sites. But the last time that I said I'm done with porn and I deleted the folder, I literally had none remaining. So that was it. Well, I still had the naked photos of women, of course, but anyways, I went on YouPorn for the first time in a really long time, and I could not believe what I was seeing. The words that were in the descriptions of every video, the titles, it was the most depraved stuff that I had ever seen. It was incest, everything along those lines that you could imagine, and that was just the default landing page, right? That's what they're just giving people from the beginning. It's like the homepage of YouTube when you don't have an account and the algorithm has nothing to go on and they give you Mr. Beast videos, like the worst of the worst, of YouTube. And so that's what YouPorn was doing as a completely new visitor. It was just giving me the worst of the worst, as if this is what everyone's watching. I looked at the popular now, and it was all stuff along those lines. I'm like, this can't be real. Like, this is all artificial, and they're promoting this as what is quote-unquote normal. But I can see why people are so far gone, sexually speaking. And as a part of this, I started reading Reddit and the dating advice and the relationship advice sections, and just reading what people are going through. And it was like entering a parallel reality. I was lamenting a little bit the lonely aspect of walking this path, but when I was reading all of that, I really started to feel a lot better about that lonely path, because I could not believe the things that people do to each other and what they're going through, the drama. Oh my gosh. I couldn't believe what these people were putting each other through, and just the triviality of the concerns that they were having. Coming from the place that I'm in currently, just being so grateful to be alive, and every day I'm just so blessed to get a little better than where I was, like on my deathbed, pretty much. And I can't believe how lucky I am to just be experiencing life. And then I read this stuff and the people are so detached from that. They're so consumed with the most mundane of mundane things as it relates to what other people are doing, and they're pointing their finger at each other, and it's like, wake up! Come on, guys! This is not what we're supposed to be doing. Stop pointing your finger at other people. Stop engaging in this silly drama. Open your hearts and minds. Figure out what's going on. Become born again. And that goes for those people who don't know anything on Reddit as much as it goes for the people that are doing the things through frontmen like Sean Combs and Jeffrey Epstein, and on the list goes. And of course, we're given those names for a reason. Just as much as we're given Mark Zuckerberg and Pavel Durov. Those people don't have any power whatsoever. Bill Gates, he's a mouthpiece. They pull his strings and things come out of his mouth based on what they put into his mind. Okay? Stop giving them all of that negative energy when you're guilty of a lot of the things that they are, just on a different scale, and you just don't know it. You're casting a stone, but you're not without sin. Alright, that's it. I'm ranting now. Hope that helped. Later.